Hello and welcome to One Story, One Voice. And in what is the last episode of this season, we join the ongoing global conversation of how power has shaped the idea of race rather than a biological belief that dominated millennia about superior and inferior human beings. Joining me today is journalist and best-selling author of Early Indians, the story of our ancestors and where we came from, that won the Shakti Bhatt Prize for the first book and various other prizes from Hindu Lit to Tata Lit and Atta Galata. But more importantly, I think the book stands out as an eminent and seminal debunking various stereotypes, preconditions at a time when there is a revival and a very violent, visceral revival of we are the superior rhetoric. But Tony, to kill this curiosity and, before we get on to other questions, you are a journalist. You were the former editor of Business World, and then you were the feature editor in Economic Times and other places. What got you interested in such a specialized subject like, population genetics, archaeology, anthropology, philology? I mean, where did this come from?
First of all, thank you, Kishalai, for inviting me to this. I'm very glad to be here. And so thank you. What interested me was actually the Harappan civilization. That has always been has been a major area of interest for me ever since I learned about it in school and would read anything that reports that came about the Harappan civilization. And it was always clear that there were three key questions that had never really been answered. Who were these Harappans? Where did they disappear? And why did it take, after their civilization disappeared, why did it take more than 1,000 years for cities to rise up in India again? So these were never questions that were clearly answered. So when I had time on my hands about 7.5 years ago, I thought, let me look at where the research stands across different fields on this question and see how closer have we got to answering these questions. That's how it started. So I went to all the Harappan sites in India, from Dholavira, Lothal, both in Gujarat, to Rakhigarhi, and would follow that up with meetings with archaeologists, historians, people who have written papers on these sites, and all of this gave me some answers, but would always leave me with even more questions. Then you realize that actually you can't answer the question of who were the Harappans unless you could answer who were the first farmers, because it is clear that the Harappan civilization arose naturally and gradually without any sudden break from the agricultural revolution that began sweeping northwestern India, starting from Balochistan about 9,000 years ago. So the question then shifted to who were the first farmers. Then you realize that you can't really answer the question of who were the first farmers unless you figured out who were the first Indians. So the scope of the project kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And halfway through it, that's about 4 years of work, it looked to me like this project will never ever be done, because there's a sea of information to be crossed. And it was not clear that it will ever be crossed to be able to answer these questions in any conclusive manner. Then you stumbled upon the area called population genetics. And then you realize that population genetics was coming up with interesting questions on population formation across the world. And then I started following that and talking to population geneticists who were writing these papers. These are highly technical papers. It takes you a long time to figure out what's actually being argued and what is the basis on which these arguments are being made. And that's how it started. And I just saw in the last 5 years, dramatic things have happened in population genetics. You know, in every science, there is a time when things change very dramatically because the discipline itself takes huge jumps forward, and it's nothing like what it used to be before. And that kind of a change happened in population genetics because population genetics has acquired the technical ability to extract DNA from people who lived thousands and tens of thousands of years ago and analyze it and understand what brought different population groups together when they moved from one place to another. So this changed our understanding of prehistory around the world, not just in South Asia, around the world. So now we have a fairly clear understanding of how the European population formed, how the American population formed, and how the Southeast Asian population formed, and also South Asia formed. But since by the time I go to population genetics, I had already done very substantive work on all the other fields, from archaeology to history to linguistics to all the other fields. So it was a lot more easier for me to connect what the new findings that we are coming from population genetics with all the other new evidence that we have been gathering from elsewhere. So that's how it happened.
Tony, it was simply your interest. You're absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah, you know, the compelling interest that you had in the subject that made you research on all these areas and to be able to produce the book, which seems incredible.
That's right. I think I had a couple of advantages in the sense that my fidelity was to the questions I had. It was not to any discipline. It really didn't matter to me whether the answers came from archaeology, linguistics, from population genetics. My fidelity is not to a discipline, but to the questions. Second was that I didn't have any preconceived notions about what the answer would be. I was willing to go with whatever results that science came up with. And so in a sense, you could say that I just happened to be at the right time at the right place in the right time, except that I had to stand at the right place for a very long time.
For a very long time. You know, we usually begin the show with a story, with a current story or a trend that's going around. And, you know, of course, globally, we've seen over the last several weeks of extremely forceful and emphatic global movement against racism with a hashtag Black Lives Matter following the police brutality in the United States. Now, even as the virus has locked down the humanity with no end at sight, but ethnic and religious nationalism still keeps rising its ugly head around the world, often fueled by misinformation. And misinformation around race science, of course, is the great contribution of the academia and the scientific community over generations. And we know that is fairly well documented. But over the last 24 hours, the big news is that in Princeton University, they're removing Woodrow Wilson. And then there's also the talk of removing the Confederate symbol in the American flag. Now, how far can we go? How far back can we go pulling down statues, removing monuments? Will that change racial and caste hierarchies?
I think we have to realize that two things. One, I think this is a watershed moment. There are times in history when injustices, deeply embedded injustices that in the normal times people shut their eyes to and are not sensitive to, are suddenly exhumed and brought out for all to see. And there is a desire to remove them, that deeply embedded injustices that are ongoing. We are not talking about injustices that had been that were there 1,000 years ago but are no longer there. We are talking about injustices that are deeply embedded in the system currently, and and in this case, all these things came out because of the deeply unjust killing of a person in the US. So when there is such a moment, it's a turning point in history. When you're trying to to exhume and root out some of the embedded injustices in the system, then I think the anger is understandable. Now, whether you should remove and destroy the statues, or is it better to actually make sure that the statues stand where they are with the full history explained before them? That's I think I would probably be happier with the second, where the statues stand where they do, but they are the context of their actions are fully explained. I think statues in particular are a way of establishing existing injustices and existing power structures firmly in the public mind. That is their purpose, and that is why I think people reacted in such a manner. For example, I'm talking about it from our own example, when Mayawati put up an alternative set of statues. It was not just her own statues, it was the statue of a whole lot of people, the kind of people whose statues would never be put up.
Yeah.
Now that is so there is a message being sent by statues that were put up even earlier. So I would look at I think it makes sense to be understanding of the emotion behind those movements. Of course, you could argue what's a better way to. I would think it is better to contextualize the statues and take away the venom that they contain in that manner, rather than destroy them. But I think we have to see it in context. These are embedded injustices that are currently ongoing. We are not talking about injustices that are done and gone.
Okay, I mean, now I'll just move back several years, to your research, to your book. 65,000 years. I mean, and come back to the present moment. If we can do that, it's almost mind-boggling to be able to, understand this whole canvas of time. But people really came from one particular area of planet Earth and moved to various places around 65,000 years ago. How do you arrive at the 65,000 years ago? And where all did they go? And eventually, what appears to me is that if this is conclusive truth, then it is the African population which is the original Homo sapiens.
Absolutely, and this is now, we now know. If you look at this has been known for quite a few years, for quite some time now, that all of the non-African populations in the world, whether we are talking about Indians, Americans, Europeans, Japanese, Chinese, whoever, they all came from a subset of the African population. How do we know this? When you look at if you do a DNA analysis of all of the human populations, you will see that the rest of the human genetic diversity is far smaller, because they come from a small subset of the African population, which has been there from at least, modern human population has been there from at least 300,000 years ago. That's the earliest fossil of a modern human that we have recovered from Africa, around 300,000 years ago, from Morocco. And we also know from genetic evidence that all of the non-African populations come from a subset of the African population that existed around 70,000 years ago. So which means that out of Africa migration happened around 70,000 years ago. And then the question is, when did they reach various parts of the world? And that we have to depend on archaeological evidence to see when did the modern humans reach different parts of the world. We know that the last continent that they reached was the Americas, and that was around 16,000 years ago. So from between 70,000 years ago and 16,000 years ago, this small band of Africans who got out from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula around 70,000 years ago, then expanded and expanded and expanded in between these two years, 70,000 years ago, 16,000 years ago. There is a interesting thing to remember, that while they were spreading like this, generations after generations, and there's a glacial age that intervened. between about 29,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago, which meant that these groups got separated from each other.
Okay.
Because large parts of the world became arid, there's no rain, it's a glacial age, and large parts of the world became uninhabitable. So people got separated in their own differing areas. And this lasted, as I said, thousands of years. So it meant there were small genetic differences that also arose between different groups depending on which regions they were in. And but still remember that even today, all modern humans carry the genome that they carry, and 99.9% of it is the same. The difference that we're talking about in the larger context are really small. So that's the first out of Africa migrations, they're called, that populated all of the world. But important thing to remember is that when the glacial age ended and the world started warming up again around 12,000 years ago, you see modern human populations in many parts of the world experimenting with agriculture. And it's not just in one place, multiple places. In fact, some of the earliest experiments took place in Southeast Asia, where people were trying to plant or cultivate yams, bananas, tubers of all kinds. But these do not have high productivity. So they don't give you high productivity so that you can change your lifestyle. But those people who were lucky enough to be in locations where they could domesticate cereals like wheat, barley, rice, etc., and they found themselves to be very lucky because these are very productive crops, and which means they can change their lifestyle from hunter-gatherers to farmers. And these lucky people, because they happen to be in these locations where the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Indians, the Chinese to begin with. And when they started cultivating, became farmers, what happens is a huge population explosion, because farmer populations grow nothing like hunter-gatherer populations. Hunter-gatherer populations grow very small, very at a very, modest rate. But farmer populations really explode. And when they explode, what happens are migrations, large migrations. So these large migrations shaped the demography of all of the world in multiple ways. This is the first very substantive demographic change that happened. And there are two other kinds of migration. So out of Africa migrations, the farming related migration, there are two more classes of migrations that shape world demography. The third one is when a group of modern humans in the Central Asian steppe figure out how to ride the horse, and also combine it with a certain mastery of a metallurgy, which they borrowed from other people that they came into contact with. So they combine mastery of a riding horse and metallurgy. And you should remember that these people have the kind of mobility that no modern humans earlier had. And then they are able to move into large areas populated by other humans already and dominate them. And thus they change the demography of a whole large part of Eurasia, from Central Asia itself to Europe, to West Asia, to South Asia, all the way up to China. So this is the third class of migrations caused by human mastery of the horse and metallurgy. Like the agricultural migrations were based on man's domination over nature to produce, to domesticate animals and farmers.
Just to interrupt you, Tony, why was the first migration happening? So the second migration you said was because of the population explosion, because there was productivity. Yeah. The third migration is because of the horse and metallurgy. But initially, the first migration, why did they migrate out?
They migrate out mostly. These are happens because of, and this applies to modern humans as well as to all other mammals. They happen because of climatic factors, which either push them out of the areas where they are into new areas, or pull them into new areas. It actually a lot of the time it happens when the world changes from a glacial age to an interglacial period, or when the world warms up. Now and then, these periods are crucial in terms of understanding migrations. So when the world starts warming up in an interglacial period, what happens is regions that were deserts become lush forests, which means animals start grazing animals move into those new regions, and their predators move obviously soon after them. So like that, it spreads and spreads and spreads. So the first migrations would have been largely determined by climatic factors. The second by man's mastery over nature. Third by man's mastery over horse and metallurgy.
Yeah.
There's one more.
Yeah.
There are these four classes. The last class of migrations, which we are all intensely aware of because this happened in historical times, that's the colonial migrations. This happened when some groups of people in Europe figured out how to travel large distances over the seas and invented the steamship and could move into areas that are already largely populated and dominate them and change the demography, as they did in the Americas, in Australia, and in many parts of the world. So these are the four classes of migrations that shaped world demography all over the world, except that in the case of India, the last one, the colonial migrations, did not change our demography because the number of migrants who came was far too small relative to the existing population. So they left no genetic or demographic mark, though they did leave a large cultural mark.
So let me come now to the title of the today's talk, which you suggested, one of your pet phrases that I have figured out, that we are all migrants, we are all mixed. Now, if this is an established fact that we are all migrants, we are all mixed, there is DNA evidence, there's genetics, there's archaeology, there are fossils, everything tells us that we are all migrants. Then where is the problem? When did this problem start about migrants? That, oh, that person is a migrant. We cannot be. We are the original people, and they came from somewhere else. Where did this enter our head?
Let me speak. I mean, the answer to that depends on. It could be different for different regions. So let me answer that with the understanding of our region of India.
Yeah, for India, yeah.
The fact that we are all migrants or that we are all mixed is not necessarily a new understanding. The only thing that has happened is now we have real scientific evidence to say that this is so, and that this is so not just for us, but for all large population groups around the world. They're all result of multiple mass migrations that happened in prehistory and in historic times. So to quote Jawaharlal Nehru from Discovery of India, as he said, this is a famous one, calls India as an ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer had completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. So this is so in a sense that we are all migrants and that we are all mixed is not new. It was not if one had said this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it would not have been led to a political controversy. But today it would. Now we have to ask why. The reason is that today we have two contending versions of nationalism. And there's one of those versions of nationalism is the version of nationalism that we all grew up with, and which evolved out of the freedom struggle against the British colonialists, which brought all Indians of all castes, all races, all religions, all languages, all regions together on one platform against the colonialists. And that was the definition of nationalism, that brought all of them together. And that version of nationalism would look at the Taj Mahal as a common heritage, would look at Mahatma Gandhi as a hero who created a platform for all Indians, and would look at Godse as a villain. Now we have had an alternative vision of nationalism that's also about 100 years old, but which had not been dominant, but which today has become dominant, which would look at the Taj Mahal as a symbol of humiliation, not as a common national heritage, would look at Gandhi as a villain and Godse as a hero, and would look at the definition of nationhood and nationalism as being defined by the majority community and not by all of the communities. So we have two contending versions of nationalism, which then the newly dominant version of nationalism demands a certain kind of history that is monolithic, that says Indian civilization is the product essentially of Arya, Sanskrit, Vedic culture, and anything that says no, that we created a common civilization of multiple migrations that shaped us, and that the Arya, Sanskrit, Vedic civilization is a major and important part of it, but that's not all of it. There we had the Harappan civilization, the civilization that precedes the arrival of Indo-European languages into the country. So we created a common civilization out of multiple streams that grew, that happened over thousands of years. So today we have contending nationalisms, and that is resulting itself in a desire to rewrite history, despite evidence from science that says all populations, and not just South Asian populations, all populations in the world are the result of multiple mass migrations that happen. So that's where the problem comes in.
Yeah, I mean, there is another strand in India, and I was thinking when George Floyd's movement happened in the US in 2014, I think, in Delhi. A young Arunachali boy called Nido Tania was beaten in Lajpat Nagar because he had colored his hair green, and they teased him. And it was a brawl basically, and it wasn't intentional murder, but he died because he went to buy paneer in a shop, I remember, in Lajpat Nagar, and there was some protests. We did go to Connaught Place protesting and singing and things like that. Within this nationalistic and all the rhetoric around nationalism, there is also a mainstream and a periphery that exists parallelly, of which we are complicit, and we sometimes almost don't look at it. How did this periphery mainstream suddenly, and not suddenly, it's always been there, how did that get into our consciousness that that some person is okay? I mean, we are a little more Indian than them, that kind of someone else is so an upper caste Hindu is more Indian, a lower caste is lesser Indian, and Arunachali or a Naga or a Kashmiri probably is not even an Indian. A closet Pakistani, a closet Chinese, and now of course we've seen even with the coronavirus the kind of language that people have been using all over the place. Even our badminton champion Jwala in Hyderabad, whose mother is a Chinese, was trolled very badly on social media. How did these things? How does the brain get wired into these?
I think it comes from a hierarchical understanding of our society, hierarchical understanding which is deeply embedded, of culture, of language, of this is superior, this is inferior, and this is the key area, and that is not the key area. I mean, it comes from all of this. That's why it is problematic to look at our civilization as coming from a single source. We are a multi-source civilization. If you do not accept it, then you have problems like there is a question that is raised by Patanjali in around 150 BCE or so, which is the land of the Arya. What's the Aryavarta? And it says it's below the Himalayas, above the Vindhyas, in the west where the Saraswati disappears, and in the east where the Kalaka forest, which is generally assumed to be the confluence of Ganga and Yamuna. So that's the heartland. So the idea of what is India and what is Aryavarta, or what is all of these are changing definitions over time. But it is important to realize that a hierarchicalized understanding of our culture is not in our nature. That's not our that is inimical to unity. the idea that a nation needs to have a single language, a single race, a single religion to be called a nation is a European idea that was popular in Europe in the last century. That's what led to the world wars, nationalism, which was deeply ingrained belief that these are essential to be a nation, which if you did not have them, you are not a nation. And that was disproven. That led to the wars, that led to serious devastation, and the world itself turned away from that kind of a definition of nationalism. Now, this idea was borrowed from Europe in real time around 1920 into India and led to the creation of an alternative nationalistic vision that required a monolithic understanding of Indian nationhood and nationality based on a single language, a single caste which is superior to everything else, a single region that is superior to everything else. And I think this is deeply divisive, as we have seen. And it also cuts at the unity of our civilization, because at the heart of the way that we have constituted ourselves over the thousands of years, over millennia, is our genius is unity in diversity. And that you can see across in our languages, in the way that we practice different things. As I say in my book, we are a common civilizational area, and we have unique questions that we ask ourselves. They're unique questions. You probably will not see those questions outside of South Asia. But the answers, we do not have common answers. We have different answers depending on our different histories and experiences and understandings in different regions. So that's the kind of diversity, and that's the kind of, so to manage that and to take it forward, you need an understanding of history as it is, which essentially comes back to the fact that we are composed out of different components, but we created a common civilization out of it.
You know, Tony, I mean, I will also ask the audience now to start asking questions. We've already got the questions coming in. I know that the questions today are going to be heavy duty questions, which people have promised to ask. So I will not take more of your time. The last thoughts that I want to part with you, and I want to, you know, probably towards the end, if we have time to end, and also to put it into context, because, you know, 65,000 years is anyway very difficult to kind of squeeze into a 30-minute or a 1-hour program. But just to put into context, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the 4 big waves of migration, the first one is out of Africa, which of course over generations takes, and they come to the Indian land, whichever area they reach first, one doesn't know, but they must have spread over a period of time. And then you have farmers from Iran coming, that is the second wave. Now these two populations, they mixed and probably create, not probably, they create the Harappan civilization. And then you have the third coming from the steppe, or the third is coming from Kazakhstan. The third one is coming from the Central Asian area. Right?
There are two agriculture related migrations that happen as far as India is concerned. One is Iran, a population related to the early farmers of Iran that mixed with the first Indians and created the Harappan civilization. Then there is also another agriculture related migration that happened from East Asia. This is as a consequence of China taking into agriculture, and which resulted in 2 major population expansion and 2 major migrations that crossed continent borders. And one of those migrations came across the land route, changing the demography all across East Asia, all of those regions. And they spread a language called Austroasiatic languages, and they reached India. In India, those languages are called Khasi, Mundari. These are spoken by tribals in Central India and Eastern India. And they are part of a larger language family called Mon Khmer, which are spoken in Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, and so on. So that's the out of Africa migrations, migration of population related to the early Iranian farmers, the East Asian migration, which is originally related to the China taking to agriculture, and fourth, the migration of the horse riding pastoralists from the steppe region more specifically from regions that today are known as Kazakhstan.
And then of course, the Vedic age comes.
Yeah.
The so-called Aryans come. The problematic word basically enters the. I mean, it becomes a problematic much later. But then the Aryas come, and then there's a. I mean, I'm talking only of the Indian context, and then there's a sudden consolidation, at least the way historians interpret or the way we were written about the Hinduization, and I suppose the whole idea of the Hindu Rashtra then goes back to these the misconceptions. They conveniently pick only a certain part of the history of, and they forget the previous migrations. Am I?
That's right.
Would I
That's
be
right.
placing that?
I would say that there is a blind spot in the sense that I have been to the many of the it's a blind spot that is similar to the to our neighbors to the west, Pakistan. They have a blindness when it comes to the history of the subcontinent before the Arab some of the invasions that happened from West Asia. So we have a blindness to our history, to our prehistory before the last of the migrations that we talked about, which is why if I go to Tholawera, the Harappan civilization site, it's a stunning site. Yeah, you have to go there. You should, it's a stunning site. It's a life-changing experience for me to stand there and see and feel what our ancestors created 4,600 years ago. And but you go there, you will not find anybody there. Very few visitors. Because it's not in our cultural consciousness. Why is it not in our cultural consciousness? Because it's not talked about in our epics, it's not in our consciousness. If you go to Bhimbedka, which is an amazing site, it's a few hours away from Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh, where it has been in continuous occupation for nearly 100,000 years, until 2,000 years ago or so. Which means that they were occupied by modern humans arrived here only 65,000 years ago, which means they were being occupied by other Homo species even before them. But these are stunning sites. We do not have a sense or a connection to them. And even the Harappan civilization, when we read about it, we do not read about it as our history. We read about it mostly in a disconnected form, as if we are reading about the Mesopotamia or something else. Why? Because there is no cultural connect. So we do have a blindness to our own prehistory, and which has to be brought into our understanding, especially since we now know, this is something which we did not know earlier, 60 to 65% of the ancestry of almost all population groups in India, no matter where in the caste hierarchy you stand, no matter what language you speak, no matter which region you inhabit, no matter what religion you are, 50 to 65% of your ancestry comes from the first Indians who reached here 65,000 years ago. That's a stunning fact, and which means which has a stunning implications. Very often, a lot of us look at the tribals as people who are very different from the rest of the population. Yeah. Because very different. We are very different. The tribals. Now, what we now know is that completely, absolutely meaningless. The rest of the population, the closest relatives they have anywhere in the world are the tribals. Yeah. They don't have any close relatives. That's with whom we share the maximum ancestry. So a lot of the new understanding should change the way that we look at our history, our own history, as a creation of multiple sources, multiple migrations that created our history and our practices, and as also how we look at each other. So all of this has to change.
Okay, now let's start taking the questions. The first questions comes from Sabah Nagvi, fellow journalist and a colleague as well. Fantastic session, she says. How do we link the fair skin obsession with the history of population movements and with existing hierarchies of groups that dominate local cultures?
Yeah, fairness is very much part of the injustices of the systemic injustices in the system. It would be difficult to I don't think I have a direct answer. So I can only try to explore so there are lots of things that are not clear. So I can try to explore the question in a manner. If you look at when you look at the earliest the scriptures which were written after the arrival of the migrants from the Central Asian steppe, the earliest the scriptures, the Rig Veda, for example, there is no suggestion of a caste system or of a suggestion of we also know that people mix with each other. There are lots of rishis whose mothers are in later times would be considered as lower caste. Many of them, and they even talk about so that it is fairly clear that in the early stages of those migration, at least on a mixing between people were common, but that came to an end. Genetics says that the mixing between population groups came to an end almost 2000 years later, at the beginning of the Common Era. So the way that you make sense of it is that in the population groups that migrated from the Central Asian steppe, all of them were not of the same mind. There were particular groups that were insistent on not mixing, either genetically or even their language, but not all of them were of similar, there were significant mixing that happened. But around 2000 years ago, the idea of purity, the idea that that the society has to be organized around a hierarchy took place. And I think the hardened version of prejudices that relate to fairness and that relate to color would probably begin from that period, which is around 2000 years ago. But it is possible that seeds of it you would still find in earlier scriptures also, where fairness is regarded as something of a, but I think the harder version of it begins with the setting in of the caste system that happened around 2000 years ago.
I'm again asking the viewers to please type in key in your question. The show is being live streamed on YouTube and on Facebook. I know that there are a lot of people watching and listening. Please join the discussion, join the conversation. This is the last of this season of this series of One Story, One Voice. And it's an extremely fascinating topic for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. And it's not just about being fascinated and about being intrigued about who we are or where we came from, though I really don't care, except for the fact that I came from my parents. I mean, beyond that, I'm not really bothered, but we did come from somewhere. But it is also very important in terms of the politics which determine, which kind of rule us right now. I mean, so across the world, not just in this country. So to be able to understand that, this is the conversation and where I would request all of you to participate. Now, Lipika Kamra, who teaches also as a colleague out here at the Jindal Global University, asks, in what way can information about migrations and where we actually come from be incorporated into school curricula? It is a difficult given politics, but this might be difficult. But is there a way out? Is there a way out? I think, yeah, how to bring it into the school curriculum?
The best way to bring it in is in the way of how global population groups are formed, and it's not a difficult story, and it's an important story. And I think this has to be there in all textbooks all over the world. That all human population groups are the result of mixtures, are the result of mass migrations that happened both in prehistory and in historic times. And so there is an easy way. As I said, I have structured it into 4 classes of migrations because these 4 classes of migrations are aware of a kind that they were driven by historic forces, and therefore their impact was global rather than, across the world. and much beyond national boundaries as they are known today. So that's, I think, would be, and once you have talked about how all global populations are the result of mass migrations, then you can talk about, okay, so then you're talking about, so what does that mean? What specific and particular migrations is caused Indian population groups to be as they are? And I think it is also important to say, that's why whenever I say that we are the result of migrations, I always make it a point to also say, which is true, that we are mixed. So this is not about creating divisions, but it is about creating that we are a mixed population of multiple migrations. We carry, almost all population groups in this in the country, except one or two exceptions, would carry the genetic ancestry of the 4 migrations that we talked about. So we all carry all of those ancestries. So it is important to also say that we are mixed, but we are the result of 4 migrations, and we carry different elements of those experiences, of those ancestries, and it's important for us to be sensitive to the way that we have been put together, and which is that we are a diverse but united civilization. Yeah.
So someone asks a related question, that if we are all mixed, then the concept of race is not relevant, right? I mean, actually, the
Absolutely.
concept of race has been debunked already.
Absolutely. I would definitely say that race is meaningless. It's not a word that should be used. It is meaningless because every population group that you take today, it is a mixture of other ancient population groups, which themselves are mixtures of previous population groups, because all of the world has seen massive migrations in the last 10,000 years. Europe, for example, if you look at the Cheddar Man on Google, you will find a picture of the man who originally lived in Britain. It was discovered from, I think it is dates from about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, and it was discovered from somewhere in Sussex. And you will see the actual, from the DNA, that they have been able to reconfigure his face. He's dark. He has blue eyes though, and that's the first occupant people of Europe, and that's the first hunter-gatherers of Europe. And we know that in the last 10,000 years, the population of Europe changed twice over. First, a population of early farmers from Turkey, or what was earlier called Anatolia, moved into Europe around 9,000 years ago, significantly displacing the earlier first hunter-gatherers of Europe, to some extent mixing with them. So that was about 9,000 years ago. Then 5,000 years ago, the same steppe people who came here around 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, they moved into Europe, significantly displacing the earlier already existing farmers, or mixing with them to some extent, and also mixing to whatever remained of the original hunter-gatherer population. So the European population actually went through 2 major turnovers and changes in just the last 10,000 years. And so there is nothing, and this is the story of almost all parts of the world. So this is something that has to be told. It has to be part of our curriculum. It should be ingrained in us. And that's the way that we tackle the problem of racism. What race are you talking about? There is no such thing as a pure race. All races are, all population groups are mixed.
This Pooja Pandey, who is author of a recently released book called Moms Speak, she says that not so much as a question, but as a comment, I suppose. But these points are so important for today's times, and yet as unpalatable as it sounds, they make too much sense for today's times. The absolute vanishing almost of reason, rationality, logic, what we like to call the post-truth world, makes the communication of these truths challenging and hence important too. If Tony has any thoughts on this.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, I agree with all of that is said. And I think at least through a large part of one's life, you thought that the battles that reason had to fight with the church, with the establishment, was battles one thought that those were battles of the past. But now what you realize is that no, that the battle that reason has to fight never ends. It has to be continuously, it's a continuous battle. It never ends. It is not. It's not the past. It's our present, and it has to be fought. For anyone who believes that it is destructive to let reason down, need to fight, need to step up, and need to keep fighting to use reason to understand ourselves, to relate to each other, and to understand our past. So
Vibhuti,
yeah, I completely understand that.
Vibhuti Sachdev asks, claim to being an original inhabitant is connected to claims of power, authority, and control, isn't it?
Yes, to some extent. But it also changes with circumstance. There was a time when the idea of that came to India. There were quite a few of the early right-wing ideologists. We were quite happy to accept that idea. We didn't have a problem with it. And if you read Savarkar's book, you would see in the beginning pages itself, he has no problem with talking about idea as people who came in. So there were quite a few. So the idea that this was always opposed is not true. They were quite happy to accept it, to the extent that it almost gave them a superiority. It reinforced the idea that as we came from elsewhere, we are superior. And but it is also a costly. It's also a costly idea in a democracy where there is vote for. There is a principle of one vote for one person. So the opposition to the idea of migrations, it's possible that that's the result of the realization that it carries a huge cost. So yeah. So to answer the question whether to claiming original status is equivalent to saying it's a more difficult question to answer. But as I said, the point is also that no matter, we are all mixed to some extent in differing proportions. That's also important. We are all mixed, but in differing proportions. If you look at Eastern India, you would find East Asian ancestry to a larger extent. If you look at Northern or Western India, you would find more of the West Asian and Central Asian ancestry. If you look at Southern India, you would find more of the First Indian ancestry. But all of us are mixed in ways.
I think you've just answered briefly the question that I was about to ask from someone called Rajneesh, who said that if so much mixing has happened, then why don't we all look similar? Or to put the same question another way, by when do you think all humans will become homogeneous? I mean, if we are mixing so much, then why do we have such starkly different features? If the tribals are our direct relatives, then obviously they look completely different than what we look like. And what is this? Why can't we look a little more similar? I mean, there could be some dissimilarity, but some similarity is going to probably do away with this idea that this person is different, or I am superior, or someone is inferior. Is there a possibility of that?
Well, I think these are, to some extent, they are subjective, no? Because in the sense that I'm sure if a Chinese looks at the Indians, he'll say they all look similar. Just as we might look at one Chinese and say, why do they all look so similar? So to some extent, I think we also become more sensitive to differences, the more that we know each other. And I think that will really never go away. And also that if there is no more mixing, it doesn't mean you will see more of it more widely distributed. It doesn't necessarily mean that those differences go away. You would now there may be a concentration of this kind of a pattern in this area and less in that area. I think more mixing means that you would see more of it distributed all over. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Maushami Mukherjee, who's also a colleague out here, is asking, can projects like the History Project mainstream within the Indian school system, taking into consideration the politics surrounding the construction of history in post-colonial India? The History Project is a groundbreaking new approach to learning history that trains students to look at all sides of a story and drawing their own conclusions. Okay, so there is something called a History Project, which basically is an approach to give all sides of a story. But this one pretty much, I suppose, is very conclusive. I mean, I don't think so there is any need for students to draw their own conclusion. I mean, you know, there is enough data science to say that we are all mixed and we are all migrants, right?
Yeah, that's what, as I said, this has to be understood as that what we today have is a far clearer understanding of prehistory in general. We are not talking about prehistory of just South Asia. It's about prehistory of in general. Why is that important? Because of ancient DNA that has been recovered, hundreds and hundreds of ancient DNA samples that are recovered from all over the world. What we now have is a migration history over thousands of years that fits like a jigsaw puzzle. Because they cross over national boundaries, right? So it is difficult to overthrow that because it's an international global jigsaw puzzle that evidence has put together. So that's why it's robust in that sense.
Someone is asking, how is our milk drinking habit, or how does milk drinking habit fit into genetics of migration?
Absolutely. When I came across this, I was quite stunned because it was amazing. Because it explains a lot of our dietary habits across the subcontinent. Because we often think, we know for a fact, for example, that Western and Northern India people drink a lot more milk, while Southern and Eastern Indian people drink far less milk. And on the other hand, the Northern and Western Indian people eat far less fish or meat, and which is exactly the reverse with Southern or Eastern Indian people. We have often looked at these as cultural patterns. Now we know that there are underlying genetic reasons for it, and that is related to a gene, a gene that allows human adults to consume milk. All human children can consume milk with or without this gene. But this particular gene allows humans to continue consuming milk even after they have crossed their childhood. That only a minority of Indians have that gene, which is also widely distributed in Europe. And that gene is more prevalent in Northern and Western India, almost non-existent in Eastern India, and existent to a much lower extent in Southern India. So that explains why milk is consumed far more in Northern and Western India and far less in Southern and Eastern India, because adults in these regions can't, it's not something that they would drink. Now comes the next stage, is that if you have the option, so the people with this gene also have the option of depending more on milk for animal protein and far less on fish or meat if they so desire, and which is what seems to have happened. They drink far more milk but take far less animal protein in the form of fish or meat. But that is not the case that's not an option that is open to the majority of the people in Eastern or Northern India. That's not a trade-off that they can do.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm saying even in something like eating habit, which you would think is purely cultural, you're saying that our differences have far more deeper and underlying reasons. Wow. That's why the attempt to create, to discipline our civilization into a uniform format is prone to mishaps and doomed to failure. It can't work, because that's how we are. That's our history that you see.
I'm reminded of a small little anecdote of an Indian Express young journalist who took an assignment and went to Manipur. And after reaching Manipur, and in Imphal, for a very long time, there used to be our friend Pradeep Hanjovan, who used to be the listening post. So anyone who's going out there would say, do you know anyone out there? And then I would say, or others would say, call up Pradeep. And as if he's the only person out there. So there used to be a couple of people. And this girl reached Imphal, woke up in the morning. It's her new place. And she goes out to look for a mother diary. Now, there is no mother diary in Imphal. So she calls up Pradeep to say that there is no mother diary out here. Where do I get milk from? How can North India not wake up in the morning and get milk? So Pradeep, makes a little fun and says that, we are lactose intolerant. You will not find milk. So, and she says that she's very embarrassed today, but she says the entire day she called up people, all friends all over Delhi, and said, you know what, people out here are lactose intolerant. So, but it is true that in the eastern part, people are a little lactose intolerant. I think they're getting more and more tolerant with each passing day, but genetically they are lactose intolerant. So the milk drinking habit, I suddenly remembered that. There is, we are almost running out of time, but maybe last couple of questions. Amit Lahiri asks the question, the Human Genome Project proved that 99.9% of the genes are same, all human races. Your assertion of us Indians as mixed races some 65,000 years back. So why unity and diversity more rhetoric than a reality? Okay, so
99.9% is a figure that I quoted in this while in the book as well as while we were discussing now. That is true. 99.9% of the DNA of all humans are the same. But we also, the largest, even after assuming that, the largest diversity that you see today among all human populations will be in Africa. Why? Because the genetic diversity is a function of how long, because mutations happen with each reproduction, right? So how long a particular population has been in a region and how large that population has been. These are the two factors. Apart from, of course, you could also say migrations. So you could say there are three factors that determine how diverse a population is. And as a continent, Africa would be the continent with the largest diversity in terms of human genetics, human genetic diversity. The second region would be India, because the largest, from about 20,000 years ago, this has been the center of the modern human population. So our stand as one of the largest, most populated countries in the world is not recent. It's a very old track record that they have held, even from 20,000 years ago. So we have had a very large population and a very long time that they have lived here, one of the longest after Africa. So our genetic, and on top of that, we have had 4 major migrations that have added to all that diversity that happened over time. So therefore, we are one of the most diverse regions and countries in the world. So whenever I say India, you should remember that I use India in the old sense of the term, and not just the borders of the Republic of India as it is today, but India as it was understood as all of South Asia.
Pallavi Raghavan, a historian, was a colleague at JTU, now teaches at Ashoka University, and has recently published a book, asks, what does this tell us about the transient nature of nation states? Does the story of global waves of migrations over millennia show us that nation states are not designed to last as important categories of difference?
I would tend to agree with that. Nation states, in any case, as we all know, is a very recent phenomenon, not more than a century or so, or 1 or 2 centuries, if you look at the earliest. So the idea that, and I do not see them as we are today going through globalization, for example, is a major topic, right, which concerns everybody. There are people for it, there are people against it. So the idea of what is a nation, what is not, I think, is what we are in, is in a transition stage. So what comes next, I mean, I have no clue. I don't think anybody has. But I think these are fluid identities, and at every time it looks as these fluid identities look like they have been there forever, they're eternal, and they're very solid. But in reality, they are not. They're fluid. They will keep changing over time.
P.W. Swaran asks, we also see a lot of DNA evidence-based research that supports the out of India theory. How do you respond to this?
This is not true. It's a simple question. I know that as we discussed this politically, this is a high stakes political issue for the establishment. So there's a lot of effort that is going on to say, no, this is not true. This is not what the science says. There's a simple question to ask. We know that the first Indian ancestry is strong. My book talks about the first Indian ancestry as the base of the pizza, because as I said, no matter where in the caste hierarchy you are, what language you speak, which region you inhabit, almost all population groups carry 50 to 65% of their ancestry from the first Indians across South Asia. People who were there for, and the first Indian ancestry is exclusive to South Asia. You will not find it outside of South Asia. You will not find it outside of South Asia. And even the Harappan civilization, as we know, was a mixture of the first Indians and a population related to the Iranian farmers. So even the Harappan civilization itself has significant first Indian ancestry. So if at any point of time in the last 65,000 years, there were some migration that happened from India to the west of India, to Central Asia, to West Asia, to Europe, wherever, there should be a trail, a genetic trail of the first Indian ancestry going all over there. Is there? There is not. So you have to have an answer to that question. Why is it not there? If there is an out of India migration that happened, why do we not have a first Indian ancestry trail across all those regions? There is, the factor is, there is an exception to this. There is one trail of an first Indian genetic ancestry trail. And that belongs to a group that was earlier called Gypsies, now called Roma, which is itinerant people who have left India, we now know, about 1,500 years ago, and moved all across Central Asia to Europe. Now you can find them even in the US. They number a few millions. And their genetic studies have been done on their matrilineal DNA. And they have found that their matrilineal DNA carries the most common mtDNA, matrilineal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, sorry, not matrilineal, mitochondrial DNA in India. That is M2. So when there is an actual migration that happened from India to the west of India, that's around 1,500 years ago, we do actually see the genetic trail, but we do not see it otherwise. And it is clear that this migration is obviously is not something that took land, because by the time this happened only 1,500 years ago, by the time Indo-European languages had already spread across this vast region from Iceland in the west to Bangladesh in the east. So this could not have spread the Indo-European languages. So if that is the underlying question behind it, this is the answer that anybody who says there's an out of India migration has to answer. Then where is the genetic trail of the first Indians?
Pradeep Bhattacharya is asking, and just to ask Tony, can I take another?
Yes, I don't have a problem.
There are some questions, we may as well. What's the impact of anthropology of migrants?
This is not something that I have looked at closely, so I would not know how to answer that. is there a yeah?
Then, I was talking about Rajneesh, but Rajneesh Vadera, who is a visiting faculty to our law school and to our international affairs school. Were there several different ancestors due to whom we are different? So where did the original specimens come from? The original specimens came from Africa, right? I mean, that's the subset that you're talking about.
That is right. As I said, the earliest modern skeleton that was discovered dates back to 300,000 years ago, and that was recovered, dated very recently. That was recovered from Morocco, and Darwin himself had suggested that modern humans arose in Africa, but until a few decades ago, it was still an open question, because there were quite a lot of people who said modern humans arose in different parts of the world because they evolved from other Homo species in very different parts of the world differently, and then they intermixed, and that's how the modern humans came to be. But that idea has now been gone into the dustbin, because there is Africa is where we can see a profusion of other Homo species. Africa is also where we can see a profusion of the earliest fossils of modern humans, and of course, lastly, the genetic evidence that we talked about. So I don't know whether what was that the question?
Yeah, I mean, were there several different ancestors due to whom we are different? So where did the original specimens come from?
The modern human evolution itself. I mean, we have to change many things in the way that we look at things. The earlier idea that there was one singular moment when modern humans suddenly arose is wrong. That's not the way it happened. Modern humans arose as the result of multiple beginnings, multiple what shall I say, intermixing between different Homo species, all of which have now gone extinct. We ourselves, all of us for today, for example, carry 2% of Neanderthal ancestry. All non-Africans, Africans don't carry. All non-Africans carry 1 to 2% of Neanderthal ancestry. Some of us also carry some what's called a Denisovan ancestry, which is another species. So it's a different mixtures between different parts of the Homo species that ultimately led to a group of people whom we can call, these guys are our ancestors. So it is not a unique one event. It's something that happens over hundreds of years and generations.
So P.V. Swaran, who had asked the out of India theory question just now, which you responded to, has followed up with a question saying that also what was happening in South India before the Harappans migrated into the subcontinent? Your book doesn't seem to answer this.
It was populated by the first Indians, of course. The thing is that the southern peninsula, central Indian and the southern peninsula was the most robustly populated by as we know from the tools that they had left behind, by other Homo species who were here even before the modern humans arrived, and who were here from around 1.5 million years ago. Modern humans arrived only 65,000 years ago, and they were heavily populated in the southern peninsula. So the question is, when did modern humans actually move? Because in the earliest years part of their arrival, it's likely that they stayed away from areas where other Homo species were dominant. Because we don't usually understand this. We usually think that modern humans were always so superior to other Homo species that existed. That's not true. They had more or less the same kind of brains as us. It's almost impossible to distinguish the kind of tools they made from the kind of tools modern humans made. So the modern humans had no particular advantage through a large part of the time that they lived together with other Homo species. So they were competitors. So it is likely that the other modern humans, when they came, they stayed out of the areas where other Homo species were dominant. But when could they have moved into these regions? It is likely that it happened after modern humans figured out or invented microliths. These are these microliths are stone tools which are very small, a few centimeters long, which you can use. You can fix it to bones or wood and create uh, arrows, spears, and they're very, very powerful weapons. And we can find evidence of those weapons from about 45,000 years, starting from around 45,000 years ago, both in India and in Sri Lanka. And it must have spread. It must have taken thousands of years for it to actually spread and become. But it is likely that by around 35,000 years ago, based on their new technology, and also the fact that the world was slowly moving into a glacial age by then, and there is greater competition, and around that time that they were in a dominant position, and they moved into areas that were earlier held by other Homo species. So around 35,000 years ago or after that, you would believe that modern humans also moved into what you said, the southern Indian parts of the subcontinent. So by the time that the Harappan civilization was beginning, it was all, the rest of the subcontinent was already populated by first Indians. They would have been hunter-gatherers, and the earliest evidence of agricultural experiments that are happening. Agriculture began in southern India independently, and these were not wheat and barley. They started cultivating millets and pulses, independent. So it is South India is a independent center of domestication of plants. So that happened around much later than in northwestern India, but it did happen independently there about 3000 BCE or 2800 BC, broadly around that period of time. So South India was populated by modern humans.
Then Subhashri asks a question. I'm curious to understand, is the idea of genes in this context also a social and not a biological category alone?
Why would it be a social category? I mean, I'm not sure that I understood the question.
So, I mean, the race is a social construct. I suppose.
The race, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Genes, is the idea of genes in this context also a social? When we say that, I have purer genes than anyone else. I'm not conversing with her, so I wouldn't know, but I'm presuming that this is what she's asking. But genes is more definite. Is that what you would respond?
If you're saying race is if I'm trying to if you're saying race is a social construct, but genes are more concrete, if that's the difference or comparison. See, we have not fully understood what are the specific effects of some of them. We have not fully understood how genes work in terms of all of the factors that lead to what a human being looks like. And some of the easiest things have been figured out, of course. But what does it contribute to attitudes? How does it contribute to intelligence? All of these things are too complex. And I do not think we have come anywhere near to, I don't think we are near unraveling them yet. And what we can say today is that race as we have used it so far is meaningless because of the fact that there is significant mixing that happened, and that no population group can claim to be pure. And in fact, there are a number of cases of the white supremacist groups in I read stories about them doing genetic testing and then being absolutely distressed to find that they have the kind of ancestry that they never imagined that they had. So these are, I think the social constructs do not have any reason, any scientific reason on which to exist, and they should go. And that's the job of those who value reason, I think.
I think the one last question that we can take, there are a few other questions, but questions will keep coming, and I'm happy that people are even, I'm told, discussing amongst themselves. But one question that I will pick from this, and pardon my bias, ladies and gentlemen, that I just picked up this question. During the 4 migrations, 4 waves of migrations, this is being asked by Manjushri Palit, and she's a psychologist. During the 4 waves of migration, how were women treated? Were there any equality between sexes?
See, I think things changed significantly with the invention of agriculture. I think if you have to look for when did the relationship between the sexes become different, I think we probably have to. I must say that these are not settled matters, so I'm just trying to answer the question. Because in the hunter-gatherer communities, they are more equal communities in many ways, because each person can only make food for himself maximum. You can gather together, and essentially, if 5 people can get together, they can. So essentially, it's a subsistence. There's no surplus to be had, and so there is a certain kind of equality in social, I would imagine. But when you start accumulating, when there is potential for you to accumulate, in the sense that you have figured out agriculture, and which means that if 10 people work, they can make enough food for 100 people. So there is surplus to be had. So if one person says he's in control, and he says he puts 10 people to work, and there's enough food for everybody, so he keeps the output of the 90 others to do things for himself, create a castle for him, whatever it is. So there is a surplus to be captured by force or by ideology, by creating. God wants us to do this, or God wants us to ask you to do this. So you can see all kinds of hierarchies, ideologies coming into being when agriculture begins. You can see it in the earliest cities that arise in Uruk, in a place called Uruk is the first city in Iraq. So you can see new ideologies, new ways of organizing, all of which is about controlling the output, the excess output, rather than dividing it. So I think this is the stage when a lot of the new social structures emerge. Now, whether this is the period also when gender discrimination emerges, there can be multiple ways about multiple arguments about this. There is Maria Gimbutas, who has written about the Yamnaya. Those are the people who moved into Central Asian people who moved into Europe, and then later their descendants moved into South Asia also. She talks about how the European farmers, before this Central Asian steppe pastoralists took them over, they were much more, they were a goddess-oriented culture and much more feminine. And she talks about how that culture was completely destroyed by the arrival of the Central Asian pastoralists, which was much more macho, much more male-oriented, much more male gods, and that changed. So at which of these points gender discrimination or gender relations change very substantially, or come equal to what in modern times we can see, is still, I think, an open question.
Okay. I have to really say sorry to PV Swaran, who had more questions for you, Pradeep Bhattacharya and Subramaniam Shankar Ganesh, and I'll request all of you who are questions I couldn't take because we are running out of time. We have only a specified slot within which we can operate online. I'm going to request you all to, engage with Tony. He is available on public platform like Twitter. You can always write to him, or else please write to me and I will convey it to him. And for the many students who are watching this, I'm told, I would request you all to actually take a little journey to closer sites like Rakhigiri, where, not far from where we are in Sonipat, and I'm talking in context of Hopi Jindal University. This show, of course, is organized and hosted by the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication at OP Jindal Global University. So please take an excursion when things open up to Rakhigiri to see where you came from. And if you want even more concrete evidence of who could be your possible ancestor, like a great grandmother kind of a thing, then my favorite person that I always take friends visiting Delhi to is the best preserved skeleton from Rakhigiri in the National Museum, 165 centimeters in length. That's the first room that you go. Absolutely fascinates me. I don't get tired going and looking at her very well kept, preserved thing, because that's where we came from, I suppose, if at all one is interested. But I don't think that should be the point of interest. And I think there should be a constant effort in us to be able to defy, and stereotype, prejudice, which leads to discrimination of the kind that we see currently. Thank you so much, Tony. I hope we can continue this conversation later within the classroom as well with the students. And since this is the last show, I want to also thank you, my entire research team of Aditi, Ashima, Puneet, Tushar, Sanjana, Harleen, Anjana, and of course the technical team, Vidyut, Karan, my marketing team, Nagendra. Thank you to all of you. We hope to return in August with a second season of the same. Till then, good night, good luck, and stay safe.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much to all. Bye-bye.